Welcome to the first episode of Cannibals Throughout History, with your hosts Ashlyn and
Marley.
Your favorite podcast for all things cannibals. From serial killers who cannibalize for the enjoyment to desperate life-saving measures, we use primary sources to get the most accurate information and stories to respect the people who were harmed.
And today we are discussing one of those desperate cases where it was necessary to survive. We start our story in Springfield, Illinois, with 31 people, including brothers George and Jacob Donner, businessman James Reed. We know that half the people were children. When they reached Independence, Missouri, they joined a larger wagon trail.
So, on July 20th of 1846, they divided into two separate groups. One would follow the main wagon trail, and this was the larger of the group, and the other would follow Lansford Hastings shortcut. Along the way, they picked out multiple other groups. So they picked out the Graves group, and then another group, to raise their numbers to 87 total people. Lansford Hastings wrote a book about a shortcut to get to California quicker, but he had never actually traveled it. George and Jacob had read this book and later got a letter from Hastings asking if they wanted to be led through this route by him. Hastings never showed up, and Reed got warnings from people who had traveled the route in the past and said it was nearly impossible by foot and would be impossible with a wagon. But they persisted and decided to take the shortcut anyway, and George Donner was elected to be the leader of this group. Before they got stuck, there were 29 men, 15 women, and 43 children, and they had 23 ox-drawn wagons. That's me. Patrick Green was one of the members of the Donner Party, and he brought his wife and his 7 children, one of which is a newborn baby, and the newborn baby would become the last surviving member of the Donner Party.
That was a baby sometimes.
Well, both parents and all 7 kids lived, beating the odds. He wrote, what's different about Patrick Green is that he wrote journals inside the mountain. So while he was inside, he wrote these journals, and these are some of the only surviving records of life inside the Donner Party as it was happening. So some of the early quotes from this are, "Passed the snow so deep we were unable to find the road when within 3 miles of the summit, then turned back from the shanty at Lake Shannon." And this was written November 20th of 1846. So what he's basically saying is that they were snowed in, they couldn't find the road, they were trying to find a way out with their winter encampment, but unfortunately they would be stuck in these mountains for nearly 4 months. Another part of this journal from later in that same day was, "Took our teams and wagons and made another unsuccessful attempt to cross. We have now killed most part of our cattle, having to stay here until next spring and live on poor beef." And he's talking about how they won't have enough food and will have to fight to survive to live on such a small amount of food in the cold. So and then another quote from a lot later, that's from January 26th of 1847. "Those that went to suitors not yet returned, provisions getting very scant, people getting weak, living on short allowance of hides." People resorted to eating leather from their cows and oxen to survive as opposed to eating people. They would also eat things like tree bark to just try to hold out longer until they could get out of these mountains. But unfortunately, later in that same journal entry, he would say, "Miss Murphy said here yesterday that she thought she would commence on milk and eat him. I do not think she has done so yet. It is distressing." So Miss Murphy was going to eat Milk, who was a member of the Donner Party who had already passed. And so on March 1st of 1847, he writes, "They have done it already," in reference to cannibalism. So as of March 1st, to Patrick Green's best knowledge, they have eaten people. And Patrick Green has probably also done so.
So a noticeable surviving member of the Donner Party was Virginia Reed. Virginia was 12 when she was snowed into the mountains. Like I previously mentioned, there were 31 people when they started in Springfield, consisting of 3 families along with the drivers. But by the time they got to the shortcut, there were 87 people traveling, and like I said, half of them were children. So while reading through the journals, I read that Virginia's grandmother would tell her stories about the tribes that lived in the mountains. A quote, "She had an aunt who was taken prisoner by the savages in the early settlement of Virginia and Kentucky and had remained captive in their hands for 5 years before she made her escape. But they, however, came to the Kaw River and they would need help crossing." Another quote, "The first Indians we met were the Kaws, who kept the ferry and had to take us over the Kaw River. I watched them closely, hardly daring to draw my breath, and feeling sure they would sink the boat in the middle of the stream, and very thankful when I found out they were not like the Indians in Grandma's stories." They also called their wagon the Pioneer Palace Car. Another quote from Virginia, "My father started with enough supplies to last us through the first winter in California," which we obviously know now is not true.
If they had stuck with just 31 people, do you think they would have had enough supplies?
No, I don't think they would have, because they think you're gonna starve. You're obviously going to eat, and I think they would have just eaten all of it. Like I think they could have even rationed out their cattle that they had.
Yeah.
And then another quote: "We reached California almost destitute and nearly out of clothing. Could we have looked into the future and have seen the misery before us?"
So, after some of the tragedies that happened in the Donner Party, Louis Keseberg did an interview. And Louis Keseberg was the last surviving member to be rescued. He was alone for weeks, and he supported himself through cannibalism. He's considered to be the most controversial member of the Donner Party, matched by James Reed. He was not rescued until April 21st. His interview was conducted by Edwin Bryant in 1847, so this is the same year he was rescued. He does admit to eating people, but claims it was only to survive. So, a quote from this interview is, "I did eat human flesh, but only after everything else was gone. I was starving to death." And people say that he murdered Tamsin Donner to eat her, but he denies these accusations. We don't have Tamsin's side of the story, so we can't really confirm or deny if he did or not, but he says, "I did not kill Miss Donner. She died naturally. I swear by all that is holy, I did not harm her."
Do you think that he killed her to eat her?
Well, I don't know, because, I mean, he says he didn't, but she's dead, so I'm like, ew. And she stayed, I think Tamsin was the one that stayed with her husband in the mountains, and she was alive when rescue parties came, and she chose to stay. And then she wasn't alive when Patrick Green left. So I'm not going to say anything else on that, because I'm not going to make any accusations.
Okay.
And he also says, "I've been called a monster, but they do not understand the horror we faced." And he describes how isolating it was to be left completely alone in the mountain, which he wouldn't be if Tamsin didn't die, but...
Okay, so did they make it to California? There were 47 survivors and 42 deaths. James Reed escaped. He came back for his wife and kids with the first rescue party, but not all of his kids made it out. William Eddy, a member of the Donner Party who helped rescuers like Reed, John Stark, he carried multiple kids at a time to safety. John Sinclair, there were multiple rescue attempts, but not all of them were successful because of the dangerous mountains. So by mid-December, when it became clear that the weather was not going to break, 15 of the strongest and healthiest men and women set out across the summit to escape. The escape party became known as Forlorn Hope, but they soon came to Forlorn Hope. But they soon came to realize it was not going to be easy, and it was going to be a very difficult task. A quote from History.com: "It was horrible climbing that great divide with frostbitten hands and feet weakened by hunger, panting for air. The sun reflected off the snow and ice and burned the corners of their eyes. The pain became unbearable." So we know that there were 4 brave rescue teams, one of them including James Reed, who had been expelled from the Donner Party for killing a man. However, one by one the team died from exposure and starving. But we know that there were 4 brave rescue teams, one of them including James Reed. He had been expelled from the Donner Party for killing a man. However, one by one the team died from exposure, and their starving comrades became the first of the Donner Party to break the taboo of eating the dead. Another quote: The life-sustaining flesh gave them the strength to push on, but the act also inspired a far worse crime. A man named William Foster shot and killed 2 Miwok tribesmen who were accompanying the Forlorn Hope as guides, and the survivors ate the man as if it were an animal. Ironically, the Miwok villagers who made the first contact with the 7 surviving members of the Forlorn Hope and fed and clothed them when the half-dead escape party stumbled into the valley. The harrowing journey from the Donner Lake had taken 33 days.
That is a lot. So I think the worst part about it is they were in California the entire time. They were stuck. The part of the Sierra Nevada mountains they were stuck in was in California.
It smells like a star. It smells in California.
In Southern California, in Northern California,
I didn't
and in the mountains.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it snows in California, guys. Okay, so they did make it to California, but not necessarily in the way they wanted. You're right. Feels like